What's up, all you cool cats and kittens?
Here we go again.
Today,
Come on, I haven't got much left. Just give me a few days to heal, okay? Then we'll start again on the left hand and... Me. I beg your pardon? Feed me. Chewie, you talked. You opened your trap, you thing, and you said... Feed me, Carbon! Feed me now! I can't.
today we're going to talk about plants, and my favorite plant-based movie is Little Shop of Horrors. So let's talk about plants. So this little meme made me smile because basically we are just plants with complicated emotions. So the big idea for this chapter is how do we keep from drying out? So protists that we talked about in the last episode live in aqueous environments, meaning water environments. And so plants, when they made the transition to land, had to figure out, number one, how to get water, and number two, how to keep it. So plants have life cycles that alternate between sporophytes, which are a diploid generation, and a gametophyte, which is a haploid generation. And you can see this picture shows you the difference between a sporophyte and a gametophyte. And the gametes have to bond back together to become zygotes or 2N so that it can make a diploid nucleus. Now, plants differ in which generation is dominant. Non-vascular plants, the gametophyte is the dominant generation. Non-vascular just means that they don't have any true roots, stems, or leaves. But wait, wasn't that a protist? Well, the difference is they do have cuticles and complex tissues. And I'm not talking about your nail beds. Remember, cuticles are that outer tissue that's on what we saw on the leaf when we were talking about photosynthesis. They're called bryophytes, and they include mosses and liverworts. They are quite different. Unlike protists, they do possess those cuticles and complex tissues. This is a picture of moss going through its gametophyte and sporophyte generations. In general, the gametophyte is the most dominant generation that they have, but they can produce the sporophytes as well. Now, sporophytes happen through mitosis or meiosis, and gametophytes are produced through mitosis. Vascular plants are so named because they have vascular tissue that moves water and organic materials. They can be seeded or seedless, and the dominant generation for them are sporophytes. They do have a system of leaves, roots, and shoots. The shoots are usually what we would call the stems. They are diploid and undergo meiosis to form spores. Spores don't have to have another cell to fuse with. They can produce a whole individual using just the one N, but then they will have to go through and eventually make 2N. Vascular tissue is called the phloem and the xylem. The phloem transports those GP3 molecules that we were talking about when we talked about photosynthesis. So here it's shown as sucrose, and then the xylem conducts water and minerals, okay? So think of it as two parts on the same highway. So seedless vascular plants include lycophytes and polypodiphyta, which are ferns. Lycophytes, fun fact, have highly flammable spores, and those are going to be these ones down here, and then this is going to be a fern. They have wind-blown spores to reproduce, and they are basically vascularized, but they use those spores to reproduce. Seeded vascular plants are then split into two more. of our classifications: gymnosperms and angiosperms. So the gymnosperms are going to be ones that have what we call naked seeds, and the angiosperms are going to have covered seeds. So gymnosperms, there's they produce two types of gametophytes and two types of spores. They're called that because their seeds are naked, and pollen is the male gametophyte, and it's blown to a female gametophyte. And so right here is a pine tree full of pollen, and you can see it just crash out. When we talk about being allergic to pollen, there's lots of different pollen. Usually most of us are allergic to cedar or pine tree pollen, but that's gonna produce a lot of fertile little zygotes to be able to make more of those pine trees. Conifers are probably the best known gymnosperms. The pollen deposits onto the female gametophytes, and conifers are cone-bearing trees, like pine cones and pine trees. They have needle-like leaves that have a thick cuticle, and the stomata, which remember are those little mouth openings, are recessed back into those needle-like leaves so that they don't lose very much water. There are a variety of other gymnosperms, and this picture kind of shows you some of those other gymnosperms. But conifers are those ones so-called because they have the cone that holds the ovules. Angiosperms, called that because their seeds are covered. They develop in a vessel or an ovule within an ovary. The ovary becomes the fruit, which when we eat fruit, we're actually eating the ovary of the plant. Most flowering plants, well, all flowering plants have what we call cotyledons. And basically, this is the part of the seed that nourishes the embryo so that it can grow. There's two types, the monocot and the eudicot or the dicot. You can see the difference here. Monocots tend to have one cotyledon. You can see that right here. They just have one. They have fibrous roots. They are very vascular. Their vascular system is scattered. They have parallel veins on their leaves, and their flowers come in multiples of 3. Dicots have 2 cotyledons, so you can see that there's 2 spots there for it to nourish the seed. They have tap roots. Their vascular system is ringed instead of just scattered. They have net-like veins, and their flowers are 4 or 5 petals. So this is a really good way for you to be able to visualize the difference between a monocot and a dicot. This is a picture of a flower. When we talk about flowering plants, we talk about angiosperms are flowering plants, and there's different parts. Now, flowering plants can either self-pollinate or cross-pollinate. Remember when we talked about Mendel, he used to self-pollinate to get the parent generations, and then he would cross-pollinate to get the F1 and F2 generations. The different parts on this plant, the anther is a part of the stamen, and the stamen is the male reproductive structure, and it produces pollen, the anther does. The filament is basically what holds the anther. The pistil is on this side over here. It is the female reproductive, holds the female reproductive structures, and those include the stigma, which takes in the pollen and has the pollen tube, the style, which holds up the stigma, and then the ovary, which contains the ovules or the eggs where that pollen or sperm will drop in there and fertilize so that it will become a fruit. The ovary has nectar produced near there so that pollinators will deposit their pollen near the pistil. And the sepals, which are the calyx there, that's what folds around to protect the flower. But as the fruit grows, that's going to be the little top portion of the ovary. Now, why do we care about plants? Well, we've talked about how photosynthesis is very important to keeping us alive because it produces oxygen. And for us, we really need to keep alive the pollinators. So pollination can occur either by the wind or by specific animals and insects picking up and depositing pollen in different spots. Remember when we talked about genetics, we talked about if we straight line breed, then we have less adaptability later on. So it's very important to cross pollinate plants so that genetic information from one plant can get to another plant. So bees have been in the news, and it's very important for us to save the bees because they are the number one pollinators. And those avocados that we all love, and the beautiful wildflowers that we see will become extinct if they do not have those bees to pass that pollen from the anther to the stigma of a different plant. So I hope that you guys are safe. If you have any questions, let me know, and I will talk to you guys later.